Hello, and welcome to an overview on navigating regulation specific to the value-added processing of agricultural products. My name is Martin Prue, Value-Added Agricultural Specialist with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Navigating regulation for a new or expanded venture can be tedious and confusing. Hopefully, this overview can offer some clarity. These slides will not be specific to any one value-added product, but will hopefully provide a better understanding of important considerations and the various regulatory agencies relevant to your product. The Maryland Department of Agriculture does not administer many of the licenses or regulations mentioned below, and this presentation is for informational purposes only. There are far more considerations to starting or expanding a business, but familiarity with regulatory expectations and what agencies may be associated with your proposed value-added product should offer some clarity for important decision making. In 2023, a new position was established within the Maryland Department of Agriculture, specific to value-added agriculture. With the creation of this role, value-added agriculture was defined in law to include functions beyond processing, to include experiential values, such as agritourism. For the purposes of this presentation, however, value added will mean processing a raw agricultural product into something new. Think strawberries into jam, tomatoes into sauce, grapes into wine, grain into flour, and of course, a whole lot more. Though finalized business plans are not necessary for exploring ideas and opportunities, there are some important details to be familiar with before beginning the regulatory journey. These are certainly not every important consideration, but may affect how your business will be licensed or regulated. First, what is the finished product? And what are all the necessary ingredients? How is the product stored? Does it require refrigeration? Next, where do you plan to make this product? Do you have a kitchen or facility in mind? Will you be using a home kitchen? Are you looking at a commercially licensed facility? Or perhaps you're interested in a shared space. Also, how much will be produced for each batch? And importantly, what will production look like at the beginning versus how much would you want to expand in the future? And lastly, how and where will it be sold? Regulatory framework. This slide shows the primary regulatory levels that may be associated with your proposed operation. Understanding the differences between local, state, and federal regulatory agencies should hopefully ease at least some confusion. For instance, there is a state and local health department with different oversight responsibilities. Land use and permitting will be regulated locally, typically through the County Department of Planning with some variation. Municipalities may have their own regulatory offices and oversight. At the state level, for value-added processing, the Maryland Department of Health will likely be a relevant agency for the sake of obtaining the appropriate licenses. There are other state regulations that may apply, but these listed offices and agencies will be critical to the process. Another level of regulation that may apply is federal, which will be product dependent. There are federal guidelines and a few agencies that could come into play if you are proposing value-added products such as meat or poultry, alcohol, acidified or low-acid foods, which will be expanded on in a few slides, and more. Federal agency involvement could include the FDA, one of USDA's several offices, and or the TTB. Although this slide deck focuses on food products, please note that guidelines on small-scale cosmetics will also be federal. It's important to start local. After understanding the different levels of regulation and which offices may be relevant to your proposed project, it is important to take the appropriate steps in navigating this regulatory framework. Before engaging with state agencies, it is important to start locally. Not only is there foundational information to establish locally, but there should be an available local point of contact to help navigate these processes. Although not available in all Maryland counties, most jurisdictions throughout the state have at least one agricultural specialist, typically within an Office of Agriculture or Economic Development department. If your county or jurisdiction does not have an ag specific service provider, there are still contacts that will be helpful in asking the right questions and directing you to the appropriate regulators. An up to date list of county contacts will be available at the end of this presentation. Once identifying this local point of contact or regulatory navigator, they can help clarify all local considerations and potential hurdles specific to zoning and permitting within your jurisdiction. If you are proposing a project that incorporates food service or retail components on farm, or event participation with potential product sampling, your local navigator can also put you in touch with the appropriate representatives within your local health department. Moving on to state licensing. Once it has been established that this proposed project fits with local zoning and any required permitting process is clearly laid out, it is time to explore state licensing for your value-added product. The Maryland Department of Health's Office of Food Protection should be the starting point for value-added processing licenses. There are some exceptions for products such as meat processing and alcohol manufacturing, but the Maryland Department of Health generally has three regulatory categories for value-added food processing. That includes cottage food, non-farm home processing license, and a processing license. There is a reason I'm referring to these as categories and not licenses. And that reason is because cottage food is the one category that is technically unlicensed. Cottage food allows for the limited production of specific non-hazardous foods in a residential kitchen. Although unlicensed, there are guidelines for producing under the cottage food law, which includes labeling requirements, and there is an annual revenue cap and limited sales channels. The sales of cottage food to a retail food store may be a possibility, but the product would be subject to a formal request and review process, which would assign the business an identification number. There are some resources at the end of this presentation that will offer clarity on what non-hazardous foods are allowed under cottage food law. The next two licenses required formal process reviews and licensing through the Maryland Department of Health. The on-farm home processing license is a possibility for farms interested in processing value-added products on-site in a residential kitchen. It can be a bit confusing, but this is also the license farms interested in selling farm-raised meat would apply for. This would include the frozen, packaged, and labeled cuts of meats processed by an off-site USDA-inspected facility. Cheese can be sold similarly under this license if milk from a farm was transported out of state for processing. There are still product limitations and a revenue cap under the on-farm home processing license, but there are more possibilities for production and marketing of value-added agricultural product. The standard processing license captures almost every other food product except for meat processing and alcohol manufacturing. This processing license is held to commercial standards, including waste and wastewater disposal infrastructure. Understanding these categories and where your proposed products fit, or which category you might be able to achieve from a cost feasibility standpoint, is an important part of the regulatory process. And there are other regulatory agencies that will play a role in reaching compliance, but the purpose of this presentation is to lay out the appropriate path of navigating these frameworks. The Maryland Department of Environment will play a role, though possibly through your local health department. Relevant for all processing, but something to be conscious of for on-farm home processing or outfitting a structure on farm for a processing license. Potable water and wastewater disposal are important considerations. Processing wastewater discharge for farmland application may be a possibility through MDE, but it's important to talk all of these considerations out with your local navigator and agencies. There may be costs associated with these important considerations, and following these steps as presented will hopefully reduce unforeseen hurdles and expenses, allowing a streamlined trip to compliance and profitability. Although alcohol is not covered significantly through this presentation, it is important to know there is a state licensing component. Although this is a process that actually begins at the federal level, pending local due diligence, The Maryland Alcohol, Tobacco, and Cannabis Commission, also known as ATCC, is now the agency that issues state licenses for alcohol manufacturing. There are a few federal agencies that could apply to proposed value-added products. This is not meant to be overwhelming, so we will just briefly touch on three offices to be familiar with. If you should need more guidance or information on the federal level, contact information will be provided at the end of this presentation for you to follow up with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. The U.S. Department of Agriculture plays a large role in agricultural regulation, but the Food Safety Inspection Service, known as FSIS, oversees and regulates meat and catfish processing. The slaughter and further processing of meat or catfish for distribution will require a federal grant of inspection. As mentioned earlier, a proposed alcohol manufacturer will apply for federal licensing through the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB. This licensing must be obtained before being issued a state license. The last federal agency to mention in this presentation is the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. The FDA provides a lot of regulation and guidelines that could be relevant to your project. This includes federal guidance on food safety, milk and dairy products, and although it's not a food product, we get a lot of questions, cosmetics. If you are proposing a product that may qualify as an acidified food, the FDA requires a completion of what they call a BPCS course, which stands for a Better Process Control School. It is important to be familiar with FDA guidelines that might apply to your product. This list of additional considerations is important to keep in mind throughout the process and for any potential business expansion. Your licensing will allow for the products and activities submitted and approved. Adding a new product or expanding into food service could absolutely require further licensing. Stay engaged with your local agricultural or business development specialist if product or business expansion is something you are considering. Lastly, this slide contains links that can help you along the regulatory process. Included are a contact list for county level specialists, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, a regulatory decision tree published by the Agriculture Law Education Initiative with UMD, which contains a lot of great content and decision making regarding what type of products you're proposing or what you might be interested in producing and what agencies may come into play. Next, there are some important pages for relevant health department offices within the Office of Food Protection, including the Center for Milk and Dairy Product Safety and the Center for Facility and Process Review. And lastly, we've included a resource tab for food safety established by the University of Maryland Extension. This was a lot of information in a short time. There are numerous resources and materials available beyond what was shared here. Should you need any further direction or be interested in discussing a specific product, please do not hesitate to reach out. The slide deck will be available in PDF form on this same page. Should you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Thank you.